When the law is a smokescreen, justice is subverted into a tool of the powerful, and those in power view the common good as a commodity to be bought and sold. That's no longer governance. That's domination. Join in on this dramatic story. Don't forget to share and follow so you don't miss the next mysteries. A once-dreamed community, now a fiefdom ruled by the iron fist of Margaret Maggie Holloway. As president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, she's not just a manager, she's a manipulator. Maggie doesn't just make rules, she enforces them through fear. Under Maggie, HOAs are no longer community organizations but control machines, where power is the weapon and residents are pawns forced to obey. She doesn't need to shout at anyone to scare them. Her signature can turn someone's life into a living hell. Maggie's rules leave no room for flexibility. If you paint your house the wrong color from the 3 standard colors, you get a $500 fine. If your car is parked in front of your house for more than 2 hours, a warning letter arrives the next day. If your trash can isn't in the right spot, even if it's just a few inches, you get another fine. But the numbers don't matter. What matters is that no one has the right to refuse her orders. No one dares to defy Maggie without paying a price. Those who dare to defy the HOA are quickly taught. The warnings start out mild, a letter demanding compliance, a reminder from HOA staff. If you ignore them, the deterrence gets more severe. Trash shows up on your doorstep every morning. A mysterious nail is driven into your tire. A sudden and inexplicable spike in your water or electric bill. And if you still don't budge, the HOA has ways to kick you out of the neighborhood forever. Rick Dalton, the HOA supervisor, is Maggie's instrument of power. The middle-aged man doesn't need to threaten anyone, he just gives orders. A phone call from him can cause someone's mortgage to be suddenly canceled or their insurance to skyrocket. Those who defy the HOA can be reported for violations over and over again until they have no choice but to sell their home and leave. No one helped anyone because everyone understood one thing: confronting Maggie was self-destruction. But Maggie's control was based not only on the power of the HOA but also on the invisible fear she instilled. Under her watch, Lakeside Community was no longer a simple residential area. It had become a giant surveillance network where neighbors spied on neighbors, residents denounced each other just to protect themselves. There were no security cameras. The residents themselves were Maggie's eyes. Someone complained about the HOA at a weekend party, they'd get a warning letter the next day. A family missed their dues, their walls could be graffitied the next morning, with no one knowing who did it. Those who dared to resist, they disappeared. No one died, but they were broken. They sold their homes, left quietly. No one dared to ask why. No one knew where they went, but everyone knew they had no choice. The neighborhood grew cleaner, tidier, more perfect, like a painting Maggie had painted herself. The rest? They learned to stay quiet. Stay quiet to survive, stay quiet to avoid being targeted. Maggie didn't have to do anything directly. She created a system where everyone was complicit in her oppression. I saw it all. I saw families forced to leave because they couldn't take it anymore. I saw once happy neighbors become fearful, wary because they knew they were being watched. But I never thought I would be next. I never thought I would be one of those who bowed to the HOA, much less my family would be targeted by Maggie Holloway. But I was wrong. It all started with a maintenance fee. A ridiculous number was written on the HOA memo, $1,500. They called it a special landscaping maintenance fee, a new charge that had never been mentioned in any of the previous terms. I've seen many residents quietly pay it, not because they accepted it, but because they knew the consequences would be worse if they didn't. But not my family. We refused. and Maggie doesn't like people who refuse her. 3 days later, I opened my door to find a rotting bag of trash on my doorstep. At first, I thought someone had dropped it by accident. I cleaned it up, not suspecting anything. But then, the next morning, there was another bag. This time, it was a greasy fast food container, a sandwich wrapper stuck to the cement, as if someone had intentionally poured water on it so it wouldn't be easy to pick up. On the third day, the trash was no longer just a small bag. A large sack filled with rotting food, broken beer bottles, and smelly milk cartons sat right in front of my house. The stench was intoxicating, wafting up the porch, making anyone who passed by hold their nose. I began to understand. This was no accident. This was a warning. On Wednesday morning, I woke up with a familiar feeling of unease. I opened the door, and this time the trash wasn't just in front of my house. It was spilled onto the driveway, piled up along the front fence, as if someone had dumped a whole garbage truck right there. Flies buzzed around, clinging to every morsel of rotting food, giving off a smell that made me want to vomit. I looked around, but there was no one. Only furtive glances from the neighboring houses, looking at me with pity, or worse, complete indifference. I knew I was a target. I checked the security cameras that night. At 2:37 a.m., a white pickup truck pulled up quietly in front of my house. 2 men got out, each carrying a large garbage bag. They didn't rush, didn't hide their actions, as if they knew no one would dare do anything to them. I zoomed in on the screen, trying to get a better look. And then I saw him. Rick Dalton, the HOA supervisor, Maggie Holloway's right-hand man. I had no doubt about it. This wasn't child's play. This was punishment. HOAs don't need to handcuff anyone to force them into submission. They just need to make their lives unbearable. I stood there watching the screen, my fists clenched. I knew what Maggie was waiting for. She wanted me to surrender, to open my wallet, write a check, bow my head, and apologize for saying no to the HOA. But I didn't. The next morning the trash was there as usual, but this time I didn't clean it up. I stood there, looking at it, taking in the stench that filled the air. If this was war, I wasn't going to play by her rules. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I did know one thing. The game had just begun. I knew this was no joke. The trash in front of my house wasn't an accident. It was intentional, planned, and more importantly, it had a message. Maggie Holloway didn't just want me to do her bidding. She wanted me to bow down. I didn't clean up the mess. I didn't call the police. I knew the HOA's rules. Everything was legal on paper, and if I spoke up without proof, I would just be a troublemaker in the community's eyes. But I wasn't going to sit idly by. I needed to know who was behind this, and I needed to see for myself. I installed a new security camera system, one with night vision and motion sensors in hidden corners around the house. My old cameras might have been disabled or evaded, but this time, I wasn't going to let that happen. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, still nothing. But on the third night, at exactly 2:37 a.m., I heard a faint sound, the slow roll of tires on asphalt, an engine running almost silently. I sat in front of the monitor, my heart pounding. They were here. The black pickup truck pulled up in front of my house. No headlights, no sign of any movement, except for the silhouette of a person stepping out of the back seat. I zoomed in on the screen, trying to see better in the dim light of the streetlights. And I froze. She didn't send any men. She did it herself. Maggie was wearing an expensive black ankle-length dress, the kind she wore to big HOA events. But the strangest thing wasn't her dress. It was her demeanor. There was no rush, no stealth. She acted like she was doing her duty. She got out of the car, tight leather gloves on, dragging a large black trash bag. Two men stood behind her, Maggie's personal bodyguards, who followed her around like shadows. But they didn't touch anything. Maggie wanted to do this herself. She walked straight to my gate, bent down and placed the trash bag neatly, so precisely that it looked like it had been carefully measured before she set it down. She didn't throw it, didn't spill it, didn't toss it. Maggie did this deliberately, methodically, as if it were a ritual rather than a threat. She stood up, looked directly into the camera, and smiled. I felt my blood run cold. She knew I was watching, and she didn't care. I looked through the screen and saw Maggie turn away, saying something to two of her bodyguards. One of them nodded, and then she got into her car and drove away. No one rushed, no one hid. This wasn't a game. This was a statement. She didn't just want me to obey. She wanted me to know that she was doing this. She wanted me to know that she was the law. I sat there, stunned, watching the black and white screen as Maggie's image disappeared into the night. I thought I was just another resident protesting the HOA, but I was wrong. This was no longer about money or rules. This was about power. Maggie Holloway had made no secret of it. She wanted me to see, to understand that she could do whatever she wanted and no one could stop her. But I wasn't afraid. I couldn't be afraid. If I backed down, I would become one of those who had kept silent about her for years. Residents who had bowed their heads, paid the unreasonable fees, endured the draconian rules, and slowly been crushed under the HOA's power apparatus. But I knew it was futile to call the police. Maggie wasn't the kind of criminal who could be arrested for a few bags of trash in front of my house. She's been playing this game for too long, has built a perfect defense system, and if I simply call and report her, she'll destroy me before the law can reach her. I needed real evidence. I needed something that would bring Maggie down completely. I started digging into the HOA. Not the obvious ones like ridiculous fees or unreasonable rules, but the corruption that lay within its system. I looked at the financial statements the HOA released each year, looking for numbers that didn't match. At first, everything seemed perfect. But then I realized something. Dozens of unexplained expenses, hundreds of thousands of dollars in maintenance costs, with no sign of any actual maintenance work. Where was the money going? I followed the payments, looking for contracts the HOA had signed with outside companies. Some of the companies were legitimate, but when I looked closely, I found that some of them had no real business. They existed only on paper. And the most interesting thing? Their owners were closely connected to Maggie. She had embezzled money from the HOA. But money alone wasn't enough to bring Maggie down. I needed more. I needed to prove that the HOA wasn't just corrupt, but a full-blown criminal enterprise. I sought out residents who had lost their homes to the HOA. They weren't hard to find. They left a trail of real estate auctions, lengthy legal battles, and then disappeared. I tracked down every file, every lawsuit, every letter the HOA had sent to people who had lived at Lakeside Community. Their stories were all the same. Initially, the HOA would raise maintenance fees unreasonably. When residents protested or couldn't pay, they were attacked. Fines kept coming, new rules were enforced, especially harshly. If they still resisted, the HOA would file lawsuits. And since the HOA had control of all the laws in the neighborhood, they always won. When a resident was sued too many times and couldn't pay, the HOA could seize the property by foreclosure. They would force homeowners to sell their property for less than its actual value, then resell it at a higher price to Maggie's loyalists. This wasn't just an abuse of power. This was a coordinated scheme to seize property. I had enough evidence, but I couldn't do it alone. I contacted the former residents of Lakeside Community, the people who had been pushed out by the HOA. They were still angry, still resentful of having their homes and their dignity stolen from them. Some had left Texas, but I found a way to contact them, and when I told them what I had discovered, they were all willing to join. I also reached out to those who were still living here, who had been silent, suffering. Some refused to help, afraid of the consequences, but there were those who were too tired, too angry to continue living as victims. They wanted to fight. We couldn't just expose Maggie. We had to destroy the entire HOA. Maggie Holloway thought she was the law. I would show her what a world without her would look like. I couldn't let Maggie Holloway continue to control this neighborhood. She would pay, not in lawsuits or pointless meetings, but in the fear she had instilled in others over the years. We had a plan. Maggie was cautious, always had bodyguards with her. She was never alone, never in places she couldn't control, but everyone had a weakness. For Maggie, it was the Grand Oaks Country Club, her weekly retreat to meet the rich, where she believed power and money were the only things that mattered. That night I waited with the residents who had been her victims. We knew exactly when Maggie would leave the club, knew that she always took a shortcut through the deserted alley behind the villa to avoid the heavy traffic, and we had turned that street into our own stage. Maggie's shiny black Bentley showed up exactly as we had predicted. The headlights illuminated the small street, reflecting off the car's immaculate paint, a symbol of power, of invulnerability that Maggie had always believed in. But this time, it would not leave in one piece. As the car slowed to turn the corner, a rotting garbage bag was thrown straight down the windshield. Spoiled food, empty beer bottles, the most disgusting things the HOA had ever thrown in front of our house now returned to the person who had done it. The car braked, the wheels skidded on the asphalt, and seconds later the door was wrenched open. Maggie had no time to react. Before she could scream, 2 HOA-evicted residents had pulled her out of the back seat. Her high heels clicked against the pavement, her expensive dress now stained with the things she had used to insult others. Maggie struggled, but this time she had no power, no bodyguards, no rules to protect her. She looked around, and instead of those under her control, she saw the faces she had oppressed. People who had lost their homes to unreasonable fines. People who had woken up to trash outside their doors. Who had been threatened. Who had had to leave their neighborhoods because they could not fight the system she had built. And this time, they were not afraid. Maggie gasped, her eyes darting. She was always the one in charge, always the one giving orders, but tonight she was the prey. I stepped forward, looking her straight in the eye. For the first time in my life, Maggie Holloway was no longer the ruler. She was the loser. This was just the beginning. Maggie Holloway collapsed on the pavement, her expensive dress now smelling like the trash she had used to punish others. Around her, the residents who had been victims of the HOA stood silently, no one needing to speak. The fear Maggie had instilled over the years had finally returned, engulfing her. But this was not the end. I bent down and flipped the phone open. A recording began. Maggie's deep, steely, authoritative voice echoing through the quiet night. "He won't pay his dues? Good. Keep up the pressure. Fines for the overgrown grass, fines for the misplaced trash, fines for anything that can be put on a report. When he can't pay, we'll sue. By then, I'll have someone ready to buy the house for 30% below market value. Got it?" Her voice was cold, sharp, unflinching as she talked about pushing a family out. More calls followed. She discussed backroom deals with government insiders, arrangements to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars from the HOA fund, calculated talk about how to force residents to cave in or lose everything they own. Maggie's eyes widened, her breathing quickened. She was no longer in power. She was exposed. I didn't need to say anything more. The evidence spoke for itself. The next morning, I sent all the documents I had to the Houston Police Department, the Texas Tribune, and an anti-corruption congressman in the state. I sent not just the recordings but the manipulated financial records, the list of families forced out of their homes by HOAs, the sham real estate contracts Maggie had signed. Every line, every number, every signature, it was all in my hands. The major newspapers immediately got involved. The Texas Tribune ran a front-page headline, "Hoax Exposed, a System of Abuse and Home-Snatching Conspiracy." They weren't just talking about Maggie, they were talking about a corrupt HOA system that operated across the state, where people like her had built an empire of manipulation and exploitation. News stations aired the recording, Maggie's every word now echoing across media channels. Social media exploded. Lakeside community residents began to speak out. Fearful residents took to the streets demanding their lost homes. Evicted homeowners filed class action lawsuits. Community outrage spread like wildfire. Maggie Holloway thought she was the law, but the law had turned against her. News of Maggie Holloway spread faster than anything I've ever seen. Within 24 hours of the evidence being released, community anger was raging like wildfire. They were no longer afraid. Residents who had bowed to the HOA were on television telling their stories. Families forced to sell their homes. People who had lost everything because of unreasonable fees. People who had been threatened had their property vandalized. All of them were no longer silent. But all of that was just the prelude to the real doom. The next morning, the Lakeside Community HOA office opened as usual. Maggie showed up, head held high, her face proud as if everything was still under her control. She didn't understand that the world she had built was crumbling right under her feet. The HOA board meeting started on time, with all the board members, the people who had been complicit with Maggie in exploiting the residents, present. They sat around the elegant wooden table discussing how to deal with the crisis, how to redirect public opinion. Little did they know that the real nightmare was just beginning. 9:42 a.m., the doors to the HOA office burst open, not because of the law, but because justice had finally come knocking. FBI agents from Texas stormed in, guns drawn. One of the agents read the arrest warrant before anyone could react. Maggie Holloway stood there, transfixed. She was no longer the one in control. She was the prey. An agent stepped forward, without hesitation, the cold handcuffs tightening around Maggie's wrists. She struggled, but for the first time no one was following her orders. No power, no followers, just a helpless figure within the walls of her kingdom. The cold metal of her wrists rang out in the absolute silence of those who had once served her. The board members looked at each other, faces pale. None of them dared to speak. Maggie was led away before those who had once considered her a queen. But the FBI didn't just arrest Maggie. They ordered all HOA bank accounts frozen. Financial records were sealed, shady contracts seized, the entire HOA system examined number by number, expense by expense. Anyone involved in illegal transactions was subpoenaed. The board members struggled, tried to call lawyers, but all the doors were closed. They were too late. The arrest was reported live. Cameras captured Maggie being escorted out of the HOA office and shoved into an FBI van amid the screams of residents. The people she had threatened, the people she had forced out of their homes, the people she had feared, now stood on the sidelines, watching the fall of their former ruler. Lakeside Community was no longer Maggie Holloway's kingdom. She had become a number in the federal prison system. Maggie Holloway was arrested. The HOA was dissolved. Those who had bowed to her now panicked like rats on a sinking ship, trying to protect themselves from the consequences, but it was too late. The HOA board, which had considered itself the neighborhood's elite, was charged with a litany of crimes: fraud, embezzlement, extortion. The police sealed off the HOA office. The glass doors were sealed with investigative tape, and the once powerful Lakeside Homeowners Association sign lay torn down and scattered on the sidewalk. Residents gathered outside, staring at what had once been the epicenter of oppression with unreadable eyes. It was over. In the days that followed, the change was evident in every detail of the neighborhood. No more frivolous warning letters, no more neighbors snooping around to report violations, no more unfounded charges sent to homes. The people who had once called themselves enforcers of the law now faced justice. I walked out onto the street, looking at the houses that had once been controlled by HOAs, now the real property of the people who lived in them. Families who had been forced out were returning. Maggie's victims could now hold their heads high. No one feared being reported for letting their grass grow too tall. No one feared waking up to a pile of trash thrown in front of their door. I stood on the porch and took a deep breath. The air of freedom. No more heaviness, no more feeling of being suffocated by an invisible hand. For the first time in years, I felt like Lakeside community truly belonged to the people who lived there, not a dictator sitting in an office deciding everyone's fate with the stroke of a pen. Maggie Holloway, once the HOA queen, is now just a name on a criminal record, a forgotten person, a ghost from the past. And this neighborhood, it's truly alive. Maggie Holloway is just a name on a criminal record, but how many others are still running neighborhoods exploiting families like ours? This story isn't just about the past, it's ongoing, and the question is, are you really in control of your life?